It was the summer of 1981 when people in the small town of Ridgefield started talking about something strange that had happened at the local hospital. Back then, Ridgefield wasn't a busy place. Everyone knew everyone, and the hospital, though small, was a place people trusted deeply. Most of the town's residents were born there, treated there, and some even took their last breath there. Among the doctors, there was one man who stood out not because he was flashy or loud, but because he was the opposite. He was known as Dr. Harold Knox, a quiet man in his early 50s who always carried himself with calm confidence. He had been working at Ridgefield General Hospital for almost 20 years. People said he rarely took a day off. Even when he wasn't on call, he would be seen walking through the halls, checking on patients, asking nurses if they needed help. He had no wife or children, and many believed his life revolved entirely around his work. He had a small apartment not far from the hospital, but most nights he never went home until well past midnight. The nurses would joke that he probably slept more in the staff lounge than in his own bed, but they admired him. He was kind, patient, and never lost his temper no matter how stressful things got. One evening in late August, a heavy storm rolled through Ridgefield. The sky turned dark before sunset and thunder shook the windows of the hospital. The power flickered several times and most of the night staff were anxious to get through their shifts. But for Dr. Knox, nights like that were his favorite. He often said storms made him focus better. That night, he was scheduled to review some medical samples in the morgue, an area most people didn't like to visit after dark. The morgue was in the old part of the hospital, a section that hadn't been renovated in years. It was cold, quiet, and always smelled faintly of disinfectant. Still, for him, it was a place of peace. He often went there to work alone, especially when researching diseases or studying unusual cases. Around 9:30 p.m., a nurse saw him walking down the long corridor with a cup of coffee in his hand. He smiled politely as she passed and said, "Don't wait too long to go home. The roads will be a mess after this rain." That was the last time anyone saw him alive. When the morning staff arrived the next day, they noticed something strange. Dr. Knox's car was still parked in the hospital lot. His office light was off, but his white coat hung on the back of his chair, and his notes were open on his desk. The coffee cup he carried the night before was sitting on the corner, half empty and cold. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe he had been called to another hospital or had gone out for breakfast after his shift. But by the afternoon, when he still hadn't shown up for his usual rounds, people began to worry. The head nurse called his apartment, but there was no answer. They sent someone to check his place, but everything was in order. His bed was made, his clothes neatly folded, his keys and wallet were missing, meaning he had taken them with him. By the next day, police were involved. They searched every room, hallway, and storage area in the hospital. They questioned everyone: doctors, nurses, cleaners, even the security guard at the front desk. Nobody had seen or heard anything unusual. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken locks, nothing stolen. The only odd thing they found was that the light switch to the old morgue was turned off, even though it was always left on for safety reasons. But when officers checked inside, there was nothing suspicious, just the usual medical equipment, a few metal tables, and shelves filled with labeled jars. The disappearance quickly became the talk of the town. People came up with theories. Some said he had run away, that he might have been involved in something secret. Others believed something terrible had happened inside the hospital. The police investigated for months, but there were no leads. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. The hospital tried to move on, but it was never the same again. Some of the older nurses refused to work night shifts in the old wing anymore. They said they felt uneasy walking down those empty corridors after dark. One of them swore she heard footsteps echoing behind her one night, even though she was alone. Another claimed to have seen a shadow move past the frosted glass window of the morgue door when no one was supposed to be inside. Whether those stories were true or not, no one could tell. But they spread quickly, and soon even the newer staff began to avoid the place. The hospital board decided to close off that part of the building altogether, saying it needed repairs. In truth, they just wanted to put the whole thing behind them. For the next few years, life in Ridgefield went back to normal. The hospital continued to operate. New doctors came in and patients came and went. But if you ever mentioned Dr. Knox's name, people lowered their voices. Some felt sorry for him. Others were scared of the story itself. Time passed. The 80s turned into the 90s and new technology changed everything about medicine. The old wing of the hospital remained sealed, with its doors locked and a warning sign taped to the entrance. Dust gathered on the windows and the once busy morgue became nothing more than a forgotten room, but not everyone forgot. One of the janitors, a man named Pete, had been working at the hospital since the 70s. He had known Dr. Knox personally and often spoke fondly of him. Pete said the doctor wasn't the kind of man to run away. He believed something had happened, something that the police had missed. Sometimes during his late shifts, he would pass by the sealed door and swear he heard faint sounds coming from the other side. Probably the pipes, he would tell himself, though deep down he wasn't sure. On the 16th anniversary of the doctor's disappearance, the hospital was preparing for major renovations. The old wing was set to be torn down and replaced with a new emergency unit. Construction workers began clearing the area, moving old furniture and marking walls for demolition. One morning, a supervisor noticed the heavy door leading to the morgue. It had been welded shut years ago, but now it had to be opened for the renovation. When workers tried to cut through the rusted metal, some of them joked nervously about the story of the missing doctor. What if he's still in there? One said, laughing uneasily. Another replied, if he is, he's been waiting a long time. They didn't know that their words would soon sound far less like a joke. But that discovery, the one that would change everything, was still days away. For now, all Ridgefield remembered was the night the doctor disappeared. A man who lived his life helping others and left behind only questions. A man who was last seen walking toward a dark, quiet room at the end of a long hallway, with a cup of coffee in his hand and no idea that he would never walk out again. That night, the rain fell harder than usual, drumming against the hospital windows. The storm raged on for hours, cutting off power several times. When the lights finally came back, no one noticed that one small section of the building, the one with the morgue, remained darker than the rest. The backup generator there had failed. If anyone had gone down that corridor, they might have seen something strange. A faint light flickering behind the frosted glass door, and the sound of metal scraping softly, like someone moving inside, but no one went there. The nurses were busy, the security guard was checking another floor, and by the time morning came, the noise had stopped. By sunrise, everything looked normal again. But Dr. Knox was gone. His watch was found on his desk, stopped at 10:42 p.m. The storm had ended by then, but in the hospital's memory, that night never truly faded. It became part of the place itself, a quiet reminder of how one man could disappear in the safest building in town without leaving a single clue. Years later, when new staff joined, some of the older workers would tell them the story in whispers. "Don't go near the old morgue," they'd say half-jokingly. "That's where the doctor went missing." And though most of them laughed it off, there were always a few who felt chills when they passed that part of the hallway. The disappearance of Dr. Knox remained unsolved. But for those who had known him, it was more than just a mystery. It was a heartbreak. He had been someone who dedicated his life to helping others, yet when he needed help the most, no one was there to hear him. And for 16 long years, the truth of what really happened that night stayed hidden behind a sealed metal door, waiting for the day when someone would finally open it again. The mystery of Dr. Knox's disappearance slowly faded from the headlines, but inside Ridgefield Hospital, his absence was felt every single day. For weeks after he vanished, his office door remained closed. No one wanted to touch his things. The nurses said it felt wrong to move anything, as if he might walk back in at any moment and pick up right where he left off. His desk was still covered with handwritten notes, old patient files, and a small photograph of the hospital staff from years ago. Eventually, the hospital administration decided to pack up his belongings and send them to storage. They did it quietly without any formal notice. One evening, 2 orderlies were assigned to clear the office. They carried out the boxes in silence. One of them later said that as they turned off the light and shut the door, a strange chill ran through the hallway. He couldn't explain why, but he said it felt as if someone was still in there watching. Over time, new doctors were hired. New staff replaced the old, and patients kept coming. Ridgefield Hospital continued its work like nothing had happened. But people who had been there during those years couldn't forget. Every time the lights flickered during a storm, someone would mention the doctor. Every time a new staff member asked why the old morgue was sealed off, the older ones would just say, "Long story. Don't ask too much." By 1983, the police had officially closed the case. There was simply no evidence to go on. They ruled it as an unexplained disappearance. But the townspeople didn't buy that. In small towns, mysteries like that never die out. They turn into legends. Everyone had a theory. Some believed Dr. Knox had stumbled upon something during his research, something he wasn't supposed to see. A few claimed the government might have been involved, though there was never any proof. Others whispered that maybe he had taken his own life because of the long hours and stress. But that didn't make sense either. He had shown no signs of depression, and those who knew him said he was dedicated, not broken. Still, whispers grew louder. People said that some nights, if you passed by the old wing of the hospital, you could still see a light on behind the frosted glass of the morgue door. And sometimes, when the hallways were quiet, it sounded like footsteps coming from that end. Slow, measured, the way a doctor might walk while deep in thought. For most people, it was nothing more than a ghost story, something to share during late shifts to keep themselves awake. But for others, it wasn't so easy to laugh off. One night in 1985, a security guard named Tom was making his usual rounds. He was new to the job and had only heard bits and pieces of the story. As he passed the hallway leading to the sealed morgue, he noticed something odd. The corridor light was flickering. On, off, on again, even though the rest of the hospital's lighting was fine. He walked closer and saw that the old metal door had condensation forming around its edges, like cold air leaking from inside. He thought it was just a broken pipe or air duct, so he leaned closer to listen. He swore he heard a faint clicking sound, almost like someone tapping metal instruments. When he reported it to maintenance the next morning, they checked the area and found nothing wrong. The door was sealed tight, no air escaping, no loose wires, nothing. Tom never went near that hallway again. He switched routes for his nightly patrols, saying it just gave him a bad feeling. By the late 1980s, the story of the missing doctor had turned into a warning told to new staff. Don't work too late. Don't go poking around in the old wing. It was mostly said with a smile, but everyone could sense a layer of truth behind it. The hospital board eventually decided to close off that entire section permanently. They said it was unsafe, that the wiring was old and the structure wasn't stable. But deep down, everyone knew it was more than that. No one wanted to deal with the memories attached to those rooms. They shut the doors, welded the locks, and turned the hallway into a storage area. For years, it remained untouched. Dust settled thick across the floor. The walls grew damp from lack of ventilation, and the smell of time filled the air. Sometimes the janitors would pass by while cleaning nearby sections and swear they heard faint noises from the other side, a soft hum like old machinery trying to start again. Then, in the early 1990s, Ridgefield Hospital began to change. New management came in. They wanted to modernize the place and better equipment, better facilities, and more space for patients. Plans were made to expand the emergency ward, and to do that, they would need to reopen the sealed parts of the building. When the announcement was made, it stirred old memories among the longtime staff. Many of them were uneasy about the idea, but the younger team members, who hadn't been around in 1981, didn't see the harm. To them, it was just an old story. One of them joked that maybe they'd finally find where the doctor went. The older nurses didn't laugh. The hospital hired a construction crew to start the preliminary work. The team was told about the sealed door but wasn't given the full story. The supervisor simply said it was an old morgue that hasn't been opened in over a decade. They were to cut it open carefully, inspect it, and prepare the space for demolition. It was a humid morning in 1997 when the crew gathered in front of that door. The hallway smelled like dust and rust. The air felt heavy. The men set up their tools, chatting casually at first, but the closer they got to cutting, the quieter they became. There was something unsettling about breaking open a door that had been shut for 16 years. As sparks flew from the metal, one of the workers stepped back and covered his ears from the noise. He later said that during the cutting he thought he heard a faint thud from the other side. But the others didn't hear it, or maybe they didn't want to. It took nearly an hour to get through the thick, rusted hinges. When they finally pried the door loose, a gust of cold, stale air hit them. It was so strong that a few men coughed and stepped back. One of them shined a flashlight inside, and the beam cut through layers of dust. The morgue looked frozen in time. Tables were still in place, instruments scattered across the counters, old sheets covering some of the equipment. It was as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry. A faint hum came from one of the old power lines, though the electricity had supposedly been shut off years ago. The workers stood there silent. One of them muttered, "It feels like someone just left." They called the site supervisor to take a look. Within minutes, word spread through the hospital that the old morgue had finally been opened. Some of the older staff members came by. Curiosity mixed with dread. They peered inside, but stayed near the doorway. The walls were discolored and the air was thick, but what caught everyone's attention was a single metal chair, placed near the far corner of the room. It was turned toward the wall as if someone had been sitting there long ago. Next to it was a clipboard with papers that had yellowed with age. When the clipboard was picked up, the top sheet had a name written across it, Dr. H. Knox. That was the moment everything changed. The hospital immediately called the authorities. Police and forensic teams arrived within hours. They secured the area and began examining the room carefully. Reporters heard about it the next day, and soon Ridgefield was back in the headlines after 16 long years. The townspeople gathered outside the hospital, whispering to each other, wondering what the workers had found inside. Some said it was just old equipment. Others believed the impossible, that the missing doctor might still be there somehow. Inside the hospital, staff members who had worked during the time of his disappearance felt a mix of sadness and fear. Many of them had aged, some had retired, and a few had even moved away. But they were all drawn back to the same question that had haunted them for years. What really happened to Dr. Knox? That night, while the investigators worked behind sealed plastic sheets, the hospital staff gathered quietly in the cafeteria. They spoke in low voices, remembering small details about him, the way he greeted everyone, how he stayed late, how he loved his work. One nurse said softly, "He was the kind of man who wouldn't leave without saying goodbye." No one disagreed. The next morning, police confirmed that they had found remains inside the morgue, near the same corner where the chair stood. It wasn't announced publicly yet, but whispers spread through the building faster than any official report could. 16 years after he vanished, Dr. Knox had been found, exactly where he had last been seen walking toward on that stormy night in 1981. And though the truth was finally starting to come out, no one was prepared for what the investigation would reveal next. When the old morgue door finally opened after 16 long years, no one inside Ridgefield Hospital was ready for what came next. The place that had been locked away in silence was now filled with people in white suits, carrying cameras, gloves, and evidence boxes. The hallway that had once been empty was now crowded with whispers and the faint hum of portable lights. The discovery had shaken everyone. Most of the hospital staff stood behind the plastic barriers, too nervous to look. The smell inside the morgue was sharp, old and stale, like something that had been untouched for decades. The air felt heavy, pressing down on anyone who stepped inside. The investigators moved carefully. They began photographing everything before touching a single object. Dust covered the tables like a thick gray blanket. Instruments were scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. On one of the trays lay an open notebook, its pages yellowed with age, words still faintly visible. In the far corner, near the old storage cabinet, was a figure, slumped, still, dressed in what looked like an old white coat. One of the forensic officers knelt beside it and brushed off a layer of dust. A small metal name tag was still pinned to the coat pocket. It read, Dr. H. Knox. The room went silent. Even though 16 years had passed, everyone knew what that meant. The man who had vanished without a trace had never left the hospital. He had been there the entire time, behind a sealed door no one dared to open. The police quickly cleared the area. The hospital administration ordered the rest of the building to be closed for the day. Reporters outside were already asking questions, but no one inside was ready to talk. Some of the older staff members cried quietly when they heard the news. One of the nurses who had worked with him for years said softly, "He was just on the other side of that wall all this time. We walked past him every day." The medical examiner began the slow process of identifying the remains officially. Though the evidence was clear, they wanted to confirm everything properly. Alongside the body, they found a stethoscope. A watch stopped at 10:42 p.m., and a small brown notebook. When they opened the notebook, they realized it wasn't just a collection of random thoughts, it was a record. Every page was filled with detailed notes, charts, and observations about an unusual medical condition. The handwriting was small but neat. Each entry had a date and time, continuing right up until the night he disappeared. The last line read, "The reaction is spreading faster than expected. Must isolate before." And then the writing stopped, the pen mark trailing off across the page. That unfinished sentence would become the biggest mystery of all. The investigation quickly grew larger. Forensic experts, medical examiners, and detectives all tried to piece together what had happened. There were no signs of forced entry into the morgue. The heavy door had been locked from the inside. That meant Dr. Knox had sealed himself involuntarily, but why? They found food wrappers, an empty thermos, and a small portable lamp on one of the side tables. It was clear he had spent some time there before he died. There were also medical vials and lab samples neatly arranged beside his notes. It looked like he had been conducting experiments, not for the hospital but privately. One of the younger detectives said it out loud. "It's like he was hiding in here." But hiding from what? When the police questioned the few people who were still around from 1981, their memories came flooding back. The head nurse remembered that Dr. Knox had been working on something unusual before he disappeared. He had been studying a rare blood disorder that caused rapid tissue decay. It was something he'd been deeply interested in, staying late nights to run tests, but he had become secretive about his findings, refusing to share details even with his colleagues. At the time, everyone assumed it was just his way. He was a perfectionist who didn't like to talk until his work was complete. But looking back, they realized he might have been trying to keep something hidden. The more investigators looked, the stranger the case became. Inside the morgue, some of the equipment had been modified. There were notes about auto research and isolation testing. It seemed he was experimenting on himself, monitoring how the disease affected human cells, possibly because he believed he had been exposed to it. If that was true, it explained why he locked himself in. He might have been afraid to infect others. Days turned into weeks as the investigation continued. The local news covered the story constantly, and Ridgefield was once again in the spotlight. People from all over came to see the hospital, hoping to catch a glimpse of the place where the doctor had been found. For those who had known him personally, it was hard to believe. The idea that he had been so close all those years, trapped in that cold room, weighed heavily on their hearts. One nurse, who had worked under him as a trainee, said in an interview, he was the kind of man who wouldn't run from a problem. If he thought he could fix something, he'd stay until he did. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe he thought he could stop it and ended up paying the price. Inside the hospital, the old morgue was sealed again after the investigation, but this time not because of fear, out of respect. The space became quiet once more, but not forgotten. The police concluded that there was no foul play. Every sign pointed to a voluntary isolation. The medical notes showed that Dr. Knox believed he had come into contact with an infectious agent during one of his studies. Instead of alerting the hospital, he chose to lock himself in and continue studying it, trying to find a cure before anyone else was at risk. It was an act of both brilliance and tragedy. What remained a mystery, though, was how the morgue had stayed undisturbed for so long. There were records showing that maintenance workers had been near that wing several times over the years, but no one ever noticed anything strange. One engineer even recalled hearing a faint buzzing sound once, like a light trying to turn on behind the sealed wall. But when he checked the power grid, everything seemed normal. It was as if time itself had held that room still, waiting for the truth to be found. After the discovery, the hospital built a small memorial near the garden, with a simple plaque that read, "In memory of Dr. H. Knox, who gave everything in the pursuit of healing." People began leaving flowers there, especially on rainy nights, the kind of nights he used to work late. Some believed his spirit never left the hospital. A few staff members even claimed they could feel his presence. A quiet, watchful calm, especially in the late hours when the halls were empty. One young nurse said she once stayed past midnight doing paperwork and heard faint footsteps behind her. When she turned around, no one was there, but she found her pen, which had fallen earlier, placed neatly beside her folder. She smiled and said quietly, "Thank you." Whether or not it was imagination, people liked to believe that he was still there in some way, looking out for the place he had dedicated his life to. The story of Dr. Knox spread far beyond Ridgefield. It was covered in medical journals, documentaries, and even local school discussions. To some, he became a symbol of dedication, a man who valued his duty so deeply that he gave his life to protect others. To others, his story was a warning about obsession, about how far someone could go when they let their work consume them. But for those who knew him, he was simply a man who cared too much. A man who couldn't walk away from a mystery, even if it cost him everything. Years later, when the new wing of the hospital was completed, the area where the old morgue once stood was turned into a small staff break room. The workers said that sometimes the lights flickered in there, even though all the wiring was new. But no one was afraid. They'd smile and say, "That's just the doctor checking in." The mystery of his disappearance was finally solved, but the sense of wonder remained. People still spoke about him in quiet tones, as if he might walk through the door any moment, holding a file in his hand and asking for a cup of coffee. And maybe in some way, he never really left. The discovery of Dr. Knox's remains shook Ridgefield Hospital to its core. Even though years had passed, the moment investigators confirmed his identity, it felt as if time had turned backward. Everyone who had ever worked with him was suddenly brought back to that stormy night in 1981. The questions that had haunted them for 16 years came rushing back. Why had he gone into the morgue that night? Why did he lock himself inside? And what exactly had he been working on before he disappeared? When the initial police report came out, it explained the basic facts: that Dr. Knox had locked himself in the morgue voluntarily, and that no signs of foul play were found. But for many, that explanation didn't feel like enough. People wanted to understand the man behind the mystery. The hospital administration reopened an internal review, hoping to piece together the missing details. Boxes of old documents were pulled out from storage. His patient records, lab notes, and personal files were carefully examined. Everything that had once been forgotten was suddenly important again. At first, the files looked ordinary: test results, patient charts, medical articles. But buried among them were pages filled with strange notations and symbols, things that didn't match the standard medical reports. Some of the writings looked more like personal observations than research. There were sketches of cells, diagrams of organs, and hand-drawn charts showing patterns of decay and healing. A few of the hospital's current doctors tried to interpret them, but many of the terms he used didn't make sense. It was as if Dr. Knox had been working on something that was years ahead of his time, or something he never meant anyone else to see. The more they read, the clearer it became that he hadn't been experimenting on patients but on himself. He had written about symptoms of fatigue, loss of sensation in fingertips, and accelerated cellular breakdown. In one entry, he even mentioned testing a potential antidote, though he never explained what he was trying to cure. That part was missing. One of the younger doctors helping with the review said softly, he knew something was happening to him. He must have been terrified. Outside the hospital, the story spread fast. Reporters stood outside the gates day and night. News vans lined the street. Everyone wanted an interview, a statement, a new piece of the puzzle. But inside, those who had worked with him years ago stayed mostly quiet. For them, it wasn't just a mystery, it was personal. A retired nurse who had worked alongside Dr. Knox during his last year came back to share what she remembered. She said that in the months before he vanished, he had become distant. He spent most of his time in the lab or the morgue, and sometimes she saw him shaking slightly, as if struggling to hold a cup steady. She had asked if he was all right, and he had smiled faintly, saying, "Just tired, that's all." She said she didn't believe him then, but she didn't press further. Now she regretted it deeply. The investigation uncovered that Dr. Knox had ordered several rare chemicals through the hospital's supply system under research permits. Most were harmless on their own, but together they could be used to test new compounds or to slow tissue breakdown. It seemed like he was desperately trying to find a cure for something. But the biggest question remained. Why didn't he tell anyone? Why didn't he ask for help? Some believed he feared being removed from his position. Others thought he didn't want to risk infecting anyone else. The truth was probably a mix of both. Over the next few weeks, the old notebook found beside his body became the focus of the investigation. Every line was analyzed, and the final unfinished sentence, "must isolate before," haunted everyone who read it. It painted a picture of a man who knew his time was running out but chose isolation over exposure. To protect others, he walked into the morgue and never came out. The local newspaper ran a headline that read, "Doctor dies alone in hospital he tried to protect." For the townspeople, the story was heartbreaking. Parents who had once brought their children to him for checkups now brought flowers to the hospital gates. Former patients wrote letters to the administration, thanking him for his kindness and saying they would never forget him. But there were still strange details that didn't quite add up. The power in the morgue had somehow stayed faintly active all those years, even though the circuit was supposed to be shut off. Investigators said it could have been a wiring fault. Others weren't so sure. The idea that the lights in that room had flickered occasionally over the years made some staff members uneasy. One janitor even recalled seeing a dim glow through the small window on the morgue door late one night years ago, though at the time he dismissed it as a reflection. As the official report was finalized, the police confirmed there was no crime. Still, the hospital board decided to hold a small ceremony in Dr. Knox's honor. It wasn't a grand event, just a simple gathering in the courtyard garden where staff, both old and new, could say goodbye properly. That morning, the air was calm. A few chairs were arranged in a circle, and a small framed photo of the doctor sat on a table with a single candle beside it. The hospital director spoke softly about his dedication, his work ethic, and how his research had inspired future generations of doctors. Several nurses who had known him stood quietly, wiping away tears. One of them whispered, "He always said the body could heal itself if given the right conditions." Maybe that's what he was trying to prove. For a few moments, the hospital was still. Even the usual beeping of monitors and distant footsteps seemed to pause, as if the building itself was listening. After the ceremony, the old morgue was sealed once more, not as a crime scene but as a place of memory. They placed a small brass plaque on the wall outside that read, "Dedicated to Dr. H. Knox, whose devotion to healing will never be forgotten." In the months that followed, Ridgefield Hospital moved on, but the story of the vanished doctor continued to live quietly in the background. New doctors joined the staff, and the hospital expanded with modern equipment. But every person who worked there eventually learned about him. It became part of the hospital's history, a tale of mystery, sacrifice, and quiet courage. Sometimes, during late shifts, staff members would still hear faint sounds from the new break room that now stood above the old morgue. A drawer sliding shut on its own, a pen rolling off a counter, or the soft hum of a light that flickered for no reason. They would smile and say, "That's just the doctor checking in." To most people, that was comforting. It meant he was still watching over the place, making sure everything was in order, just as he always had. One night, nearly a year after the discovery, a nurse named Daniel stayed late to finish paperwork. The hospital was quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows. Around midnight, the lights in the hallway dimmed for a second, then came back. He looked up and laughed softly to himself. "All right, doctor," he said under his breath. "I'm almost done." Moments like that became small traditions among the staff. It was their way of keeping his memory alive. Outside the hospital, however, researchers and historians continued to study his notes. Some of the formulas and diagrams he had written down showed remarkable insight. Scientists later discovered that his work had been exploring early forms of tissue regeneration, a concept that wouldn't be fully developed until years later. In a quiet way, his work had not been in vain. His discoveries, though unfinished, had helped inspire future studies in medical science. When one of the researchers reviewing his findings was interviewed, he said Dr. Knox might have been misunderstood. People thought he was reclusive, maybe even strange, but what he really was ahead of his time. It was clear now that his disappearance wasn't about fear or guilt. It was about protection. He knew he was sick. He knew what could happen if others got exposed. And he made the hardest choice any doctor could. He isolated himself to save everyone else. 16 years of mystery had finally revealed a story not of horror, but of sacrifice. In Ridgefield, people still talk about him from time to time. When storms roll in and thunder shakes the old hospital windows, someone always mentions the night the doctor disappeared. And someone else always answers softly, "He never really left. He just stayed where he was needed most, and somehow that feels true. Even today, when new interns join the hospital, they're told the story of the doctor who vanished. They walk past the hallway where the old morgue once stood, now bright and modern, and a few of them pause for a moment. They don't speak, but there's always a quiet sense of respect, as if they can still feel his calm presence somewhere in the walls. For 16 years, his mystery remained locked behind a heavy metal door. But once it opened, it revealed not just what had happened to him, but who he truly was, a man who loved his work, who cared deeply for others, and who gave everything to protect the people he served. And in the quiet corners of Ridgefield Hospital, when the night grows long and the wind begins to howl, some still say they can hear faint footsteps echoing down the hall, steady, calm, and familiar. The sound of a doctor still making his rounds. Years passed after the discovery in Ridgefield Hospital, but the mystery of Dr. Knox continued to live quietly in people's minds. Even though the world had moved on, the small town still remembered the man who had once walked its quiet hospital halls, always wearing that thoughtful expression and speaking in a soft, measured tone. In the years that followed, the hospital was renovated again. New buildings rose. Old rooms were turned into modern labs, and the morgue where he was found was permanently closed off. But his story didn't fade. Instead, it grew into something more than a mystery. It became a lesson that every young doctor and nurse learned on their first day there. Never forget why you started, the senior doctors would say. Remember Dr. Knox, remember what true dedication looks like. People respected that. They saw his story not as something dark, but as something deeply human. A man who gave his life trying to protect others and uncover something greater. Still, there were a few who couldn't let go of the unanswered questions. A journalist named David, who had grown up in Ridgefield and remembered hearing the rumors as a child, decided to revisit the story for a new documentary. It had been more than 20 years since the morgue was unlocked and technology had come a long way. Maybe, he thought, science could now explain what once couldn't be. He got permission from the hospital to access the archives. Inside a small, dimly lit records room, he spent weeks going through dusty files, handwritten notes, and fragile photographs. Most of it was already known. The reports, the statements, the autopsy. But one afternoon, he found something that made him stop. It was an old envelope tucked inside a folder labeled Personal Effects. Inside was a small audio tape, the kind used for voice recorders in the 1980s. The label was faded, but a few words could still be read. For the record, HK. His heart raced. He immediately called the hospital board to request permission to play it. After a few days, the approval came through, and the hospital allowed him to listen to it under supervision in their conference room. When the recorder started, the room went silent. A faint hiss of static filled the air. Then a calm voice, and unmistakably that of Dr. Knox, began to speak. "If anyone ever hears this," he said, "it means I didn't make it out." There was a pause. You could hear the faint clinking of metal instruments in the background. "I've been studying a series of tissue samples that show signs of rapid cellular decline," his voice continued. "At first I thought it was contamination, but now I know it's not. It's something else. Something living." David listened intently. The words were quiet, tired, but steady. "I've noticed the symptoms in myself now. Tremors, loss of coordination. I can feel my body reacting, changing. I've isolated the compound, but there's no time to finish the antidote. I can't risk anyone else getting exposed." He took a deep breath before speaking again. "If they find me, tell them it wasn't for nothing. Tell them I did what I had to do." The tape clicked off. The room stayed silent for a long time after that. It was the first time anyone had heard the doctor's voice since 1981. The recording changed everything. It wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a story of sacrifice. He hadn't vanished out of fear or confusion. He had known exactly what was happening and made a conscious choice to protect others from it. David later included the tape in his documentary. It was titled The Doctor Who Stayed Behind. When it aired, people all across the country watched. Many wrote letters to the hospital afterward, expressing how deeply moved they were. One letter read, "He didn't just save lives. He gave up his own to make sure no one else would suffer." That's the kind of bravery we rarely see anymore. The hospital received hundreds of such messages, But the tape also raised a few new questions. What was the compound he mentioned? Was it ever identified? The answer was complicated. The remaining samples found in the morgue had long since degraded, making it impossible to test them properly. But scientists who studied his notes concluded that he had likely discovered a rare bacterial strain that caused extreme cellular breakdown, something similar to what would later be identified in certain infections years afterward. In other words, he had been right. His work, though incomplete, had pointed toward medical knowledge that wouldn't be confirmed until decades later. In his own quiet way, Dr. Knox had seen the future of medicine. Over time, the hospital decided to dedicate a small research wing in his name. It wasn't a grand building, but it was modern, bright, and full of young doctors working toward advancements in regenerative medicine, the very field he had once written about. The plaque at the entrance read, "In memory of Dr. H. Knox, whose courage and pursuit of knowledge continue to inspire." Every year on the anniversary of his disappearance, the staff would place a white rose beneath that plaque. They didn't do it as part of any formal event. It was just something that quietly continued, passed down from one generation of staff to the next. Even visitors who came to the hospital often heard about him. Some said they felt a strange calmness in certain hallways late at night, especially near the old part of the building. Others described hearing the faint sound of footsteps or the quiet squeak of a rolling cart, though no one was there. Whether or not those things were real didn't matter much. It was the feeling that mattered, the sense that someone still cared, still watched over the place he had loved. Years later, David, the journalist, was invited back to the hospital to give a small talk about his documentary. When he arrived, he noticed something new in the lobby. It was a framed photograph of Dr. Knox placed beside the original medical notes they had recovered. Beneath it was a quote written in his handwriting: "The purpose of medicine is not only to cure, but to protect." David stood there for a long time, quietly reading those words. In that moment, he realized something. The story wasn't really about how the doctor had died. It was about how he had lived. Every small decision, every long night, every quiet moment in the lab had come from the same place, a deep desire to keep people safe. That was what made the story powerful. It wasn't about mystery or fear. It was about love. Love for his patients, for his work, and for the people who trusted him. And that love had outlasted everything else. As the years continued, the world changed. Technology advanced, new diseases were cured, and Ridgefield Hospital became one of the most respected medical centers in the region. But one thing never changed: the quiet respect for the man whose story started it all. Sometimes, during late-night shifts when the halls were empty and the only sound was the soft hum of machines, young nurses would talk about him. One might say, if he were still around, he'd probably be proud of how far we've come. Another would smile and reply, maybe he is. And somewhere deep in the old foundation of the hospital, past the sealed doors and concrete walls, it almost felt true, like the spirit of that doctor still lingered, calm and steady, making sure everything stayed in order. One winter evening, decades after the discovery, the hospital held a small event marking the 50th year since Dr. Knox's disappearance. Families of past staff members attended, along with some of his distant relatives. There were speeches, old photographs, and a moment of silence. At the end, the hospital director said something that stayed with everyone who was there. He said, "Some people save lives in ways the world can see. Others do it quietly, in ways no one will ever fully understand." Dr. Knox belonged to the latter. But his impact, it's everywhere around us. The audience stood in silence. Some clapped softly, others wiped their eyes. As the evening ended, the staff lit small candles along the garden path that led to the new research wing. The glow of the lights reflected off the windows, casting soft golden patterns across the walls. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that felt like closure. But for those who truly knew the story, it wasn't just an ending. It was a reminder that sometimes real heroes don't seek recognition. They simply do what's right, even if no one ever knows the full story. And that's how Ridgefield remembered Dr. Knox. Not as a mystery, not as a headline, but as a man who made a choice that changed everything. When the last candle flickered out that night, the air around the hospital was still and calm. Somewhere, faintly, the echo of footsteps seemed to drift through the empty corridor. Slow, steady, familiar. Maybe it was just the wind. Or maybe, in some quiet way, the doctor was still walking those halls, watching over the people he once cared for. Either way, the story of his disappearance no longer felt like a tragedy. It felt like a legacy, one that would live on in every heart that chose compassion over fear, and every hand that reached out to heal. And so, the tale that began with a vanished doctor in 1981 finally found its peace, not with answers written in reports, but with the understanding that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness are the ones done in silence.